Snow had come early to Bitter Creek, that year-thick, wind-lashed drifts that swallowed fence posts and turned the whole valley into a white silence. The kind of winter that made even the hardiest ranchers mutter prayers under their breath. Up on the low rise where Bitter Creek home stood, the wind pressed against the weather-beaten boards like a hungry thing, whistling through every crack and knot. Joyce Harper wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she stepped into the kitchen. It was barely dawn, but she'd slept little anyway. Cold had a way of creeping into her bones at night, making her rise before the children did, just to get the stove warm enough so their breath wouldn't cloud in front of their face. She lifted the lid of the grain barrel and stared at the bottom, barely a handful of rice and a thin dusting of flour along the rim. "Lord," she murmured, "this wouldn't feed 3 people, let alone 17. Her voice was low and steady, but her heart pinched with worry. Tonight was Christmas Eve. The children had spent all week singing carols off-key and making paper stars from old newspaper scraps. They deserved a real meal, something warm, something that felt like a celebration, not another thin soup stretched with more water than anything else. Footsteps pattered behind her. It was May, the girl who helped in the kitchen some mornings, her brown hair tied in a loose braid, cheeks pink from the cold. "I checked the pantry," May said, rubbing her hands together. "It's just as empty as yesterday." Joyce offered a small smile, weary but trying. "We'll make do. God has seen us through tighter pinches." But even as the words left her lips, she wasn't sure she believed them. Winter had been cruel this year. Donations were sparse. Ranchers nearby were struggling themselves. For the first time since she'd taken charge of Bitter Creek home, Joyce wondered whether her faith alone was enough to keep 17 children fed. She turned toward the stove, thinking she'd try stretching the last rice into porridge, when a sudden shriek echoed from the entryway. "Miss Joyce! Miss Joyce! Come quick!" Joyce and May ran toward the front door, skirts swishing. They nearly collided with 2 boys tumbling into the hall, excitement sparking off them like static. "It's outside," the taller one yelled. "Out by the porch, come see." Joyce hurried to the door, unlatched it, and swung it open against the cold. What she saw made her breath freeze harder than the winter air. Sitting in the snow was an old wooden pushcarton of those battered freight wagons often seen outside railroad depots. But this one was piled high with food. Real food. A heavy sack of rice, loaves of fresh-baked bread wrapped in cloth, a crate of potatoes, and nestled on the top, stoppering the cold like a blessing, were 2 glass jugs filled with creamy goat's milk, still warm enough that steam fogged the glass. May covered her mouth with both hands. Where on earth did all this come from? Joyce stepped down the icy porch steps, the hem of her skirt brushing the snow. She touched the sack of rice, then the bread, afraid it might vanish under her fingers like a dream. "I don't know," she said softly. "There's no tracks, no horses, no footprints, except ours." "It's a miracle," May whispered. "Chua, maybe he heard us." Joyce looked around the empty yard, wind stirring loose snow like feathers. No lantern light moved through the trees. No figure slipped away into the darkness. Whoever had delivered the cart had done so silently, carefully, wishing to remain unseen. Her throat tightened. It was not the first time she'd prayed for help, but it was the first time help had come in the form of warm milk and fresh bread on Christmas Eve. "Bring it inside," she said, her voice steadier now. "Quickly before it freezes solid." The children swarmed the cart with shouts of delight, carrying armfuls of food into the kitchen under Joyce's watchful eye. Soon the room filled with the smell of baking bread, warming on the stove, and the faint sweetness of goat's milk heating in tin cups. By evening, the long wooden table was set with the finest feast Bitter Creek home had seen in months. The children chattered and laughed, boots thumping against the floorboards, paper stars dangling above their heads. Joyce ladled rice stew richened with potatoes into tin bowls and watched the children's faces glow. "Meoy?" little Sarah asked. She'd taken to calling Joyce Mama the year before, and soon the name had stuck with many of the younger ones. The person who brought this, they must be very kind, huh? Joyce brushed a strand of golden hair from the girl's forehead. "Yes, sweetheart. Very kind indeed." "Maybe it was Santa Claus," another child chirped, crumbs on his chin. Joyce smiled, heart swelling. "Maybe so. Or maybe the Lord sent someone with generous hands. Chúa sẽ không bỏ mặc những đứa con của Ngài." The children repeated her words softly, as if tucking them somewhere deep inside their small chests. When the meal ended and the younger children were tucked into bed, Joyce lingered at the front door. The night was clear now. The storm passed. Stars glittered above Bitter Creek, like lanterns hung from the rafters of heaven. Whoever had helped them, they had done so quietly, gently, without asking for thanks. That kind of kindness was rare in the West, rarer than gold, rarer than luck. Joyce took a small scrap of paper, wrote in her neat hand, "Thank you for your kindness, stranger." She pinned it beside the door, where anyone passing in the night might see it. Then she stepped back into the warm light of the home, unaware that somewhere beyond the trees, a man with a weather-torn coat and Apache braids was watching from the shadows, smiling for the first time in a very long while. Owen Lonehill guided the last of his goats into the small timber shed and latched the door against the cold. Night air rolled down from the Bitter Range, sharp enough to sting the lungs. His modest homestead, little more than a cabin of rough-hewn logs, a lean-to shed, and a fenced pastures at several miles south of Bitter Creek, tucked into a fold of land where the wind quieted but never slept. A single lantern burned inside the cabin window, throwing pale gold across the snow. Owen stood for a moment in the silence, listening to the soft bleating of the goats, settling in for the night. They were all he had left now. Them and the memories he tried so hard not to wake. When he finally stepped inside, heat from the small iron stove wrapped around him. He unbuttoned his coat, shook off the snow, and set the day's milk pail beside the counter. The cabin smelled faintly of cedar smoke, wool, and the lingering sweetness of goat's milk steamed earlier that morning. His gaze drifted to the shelf above the stove. On it sat a small carved flute burnt along one side, warped, half destroyed. His son had played it. Tala had laughed whenever the boy puffed his cheeks too hard and the notes squeaked. Owen reached for it sometimes, only to pull his hand back before his fingers touched the charred wood. Not tonight. He couldn't bear it tonight. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and unfolded the small slip of paper he'd collected from the orphanage door that morning. He'd waited until the children were outside, throwing snowballs, before grabbing it off the frame. 4 simple words, written in Joyce Harper's graceful hand. "Thank you for your kindness, stranger." Owen read it again, and again. The paper felt fragile between his fingers, like something without. A stranger. Yes, he was that, and he intended to stay that way. Yet her words warmed him like fire, reaching a part of him he had believed long frozen. For the first time in months, maybe years, he felt the faint pull of something other than grief. Something soft, something dangerous. Hope. He folded the note carefully and set it on the table beside his gloves. He remembered the first time he ever saw Joyce Harper. It had been mid-autumn, before the worst of the snow. He'd brought a few jugs of milk into town to sell, but most of Bitter Creek's folks avoided him unless they needed something cheap. Being Apache meant he was tolerated nothing more. Folks liked to think themselves fair, but old fears died slower than wolves in winter. He was passing the orphanage when he heard laughter. Real laughter, the kind that came from deep in the belly and rose with no shame. Joyce was kneeling on the frost-slick grass, helping a small girl tie her boots. Her golden hair was catching the sunlight, her breath fogging as she smiled, patient and warm. The children clustered around her like she was the very stove they gathered to each morning, heat and comfort and steadiness. For one long second, Owen saw Tala. Not her face. Joyce's features were different, but the kindness, the softness in her hands, the way she listened when the children spoke. Tala had been like that. Tala had understood him, without him needing to explain. And then he saw the boy. A small one, dark-haired, laughing so hard he nearly toppled over. Owen's ribs tightened. His son had laughed like that. He'd stood there a long time, frozen in place, until one of the older boys noticed him. Owen had lowered his head and moved on, ashamed of how desperately he wanted to step closer. That night, he decided to bring a little extra milk the next time he passed by. Just milk, nothing more. But when he saw the barrel of rice nearly empty through the kitchen window, days later Joyce, shaking her head with that weary look people got when they'd tried too hard for too long, he knew milk wasn't enough. And so the first cart appeared. Then another. Never enough to draw attention, but enough to keep hunger away. The axe did not heal him, not fully. But each time he set down a sack of flour or a jug of milk in the snow, the weight on his chest lightened just a little. Tonight, as he sat at his small table, boots still dusted with snow, Owen realized he wasn't doing it only for the children. He was doing it because Joyce's smile, gentle, brave, and full of stubborn hope, reminded him that his heart hadn't turned to stone after all. Later, when the moon climbed high, Owen stepped outside again, carrying 2 warm jugs of fresh goat's milk and a small parcel of bread he'd bought from the mercantile in town. He lashed everything onto the old pushcart he used for hauling hay, then tugged his scarf over his mouth and began the slow walk toward Bitter Creek home. The snow muffled his footsteps. The world felt peaceful in a way only winter nights could grant, lonely but clean, stripped down to essentials. When the orphanage came into view, its windows glowing faintly, Owen paused beneath the pines. He always hesitated here, not out of fear of being caught, but because stepping any closer meant stepping into a life he didn't think he deserved. He waited until the lights dimmed, until he saw no movement inside. Only then did he push the cart forward and leave it beside the front door. But tonight, he lingered. The gratitude note in his pocket seemed to anchor his feet to the snow. Through the frosted window, he saw Joyce gathering plates, humming as she cleaned. Her movements were tired, but still graceful. 2 of the younger children tugged on her skirt, and she knelt to kiss their foreheads goodnight. Owen's throat tightened. How easily she filled the role of mother. How wholly she gave herself. The kind of warmth he'd once had. The kind he'd lost. He stepped back into the shadows, letting the cold air steady him. He didn't belong in her world, but helping from afar was enough. It had to be. As he turned to leave, something stirred behind him, a soft whisper of wind through the branches. For a heartbeat, he imagined Tala's voice, gentle, urging, "Don't hide forever, Owen. Even wounded hearts can find their way home." He shook the thought away. Dreams were dangerous things. Still, as he walked into the dark, Owen Lonehill allowed himself a rare, quiet smile. And Bitter Creek slept under a sky full of stars, unaware that the man who saved their Christmas was closer than they knew, and far lonelier than they could imagine. The days after Christmas settled into a quiet rhythm. Bitter Creek had a way of slowing itself in midwinter, when the wind swept low across the frozen flats, and the sun shone pale as skimmed milk. The children at the orphanage didn't mind. They played in drifts taller than their boots, their laughter carrying all the way to the cottonwoods by the creek. Joyce Harper watched them from the porch, hands tucked beneath her shawl. Every morning for a week straight, she'd awaken to find a new offering, sitting neatly on that same battered pushcart. a few sacks of potatoes, a loaf of coarse bread, jars of canned peaches, and always 2 or 3 jugs of warm goat's milk. Someone was bringing them each dawn, long before she or the children woke. Someone strong enough to push that cart through snow. Someone who did not wish to be seen. But generosity had its own scent, its own heartbeat, and Joyce found herself wondering about the stranger more often than she meant to. The night it finally happened was colder than most, the kind of cold that stiffened wood and cracked door frames. The children had begged for one last story before bed, and Joyce read from the worn leather Bible until their eyelids drooped. She tucked them in, drew blankets up to little chins, and whispered soft blessings as she kissed their foreheads. Downstairs, the lantern in the front room flickered with a tired orange glow. That was when Jonas 13, lanky and too curious for his own good, came barreling down the hallway, boots untied and eyes bright. "Miss Joyce, someone's outside." Joyce's heart leapt. "What did you see?" Movement by the porch, and the pushcarts there again. Before she could scold him for looking out into the dark, a chorus of smaller feet thundered behind him. "Let's catch Santa Claus again," one shouted. No, it's the snow angel," another insisted. "Quiet down," Joyce hissed. But the children were already spilling toward the front door. She rushed after them, breath catching in her throat, not from fear, but from the sudden, unexpected hope that she might finally thank their mysterious benefactor face to face. Jonas flung the door open. Cold air knifed and seasied, and there, standing in the glow of the porch lantern, snow dusting his shoulders, was a tall man with braided black hair and a shy, startled expression. The children erupted. "Aha! We caught him! Mr. Santa! Snow angel, snow angel!" The man froze like a cornered deer. Owen Lonehill hadn't meant to get caught. He'd planned it like every other night walk-in, set down the parcels, and leave before the lantern upstairs came on. But he'd lingered. He'd paused to adjust a sack of flour so it wouldn't topple. And in that one extra moment, the front door burst open, and 17 small voices collided with him like hailstones. Joyce stepped into the doorway, breath swirling pale in the icy air. She stared at Owen, recognition dawning slowly. She'd seen him in town a few times, always quiet, always polite, always alone. An Apache man who sold goat's milk and kept to himself. "You," she whispered, "you're the one who's been helping us?" Owen swallowed hard, his voice rough from disuse. "Yes, ma'am. I didn't aim to frighten anyone." Jonas grabbed his sleeve. "You brought us milk and bread and potatoes." A faint blush crept across Owen's cheekbones. "Reckon I did." Joyce descended the steps slowly, snow crunching beneath her boots. Up close, she noticed things she hadn't before. How tired his eyes looked. How careful he held himself, like a man afraid of breaking something precious. "Why didn't you tell us who you were?" she asked softly. He shifted his weight, eyes dropping. "Didn't think it mattered. I just wanted to help. I like the little ones. They remind me." His voice thinned. "Remind me of what I lost." The children went quiet, sensing the heaviness in his words. Joyce's gaze softened. "You lost family?" Owen nodded once. "My wife and my boy. Fire took 'em. Been hard to find light after that." Joyce's breath caught. She felt an ache for him, deep, human, and immediate. But before she could speak, Owen added, absolutely earnest and absolutely terrified, "And do like you too, Miss Joyce." Silence. Then giggles burst from behind her. A few children clapped. One boy shouted, "He likes our mama." Joyce's cheeks warmed. Owen looked like he wished the snow would swallow him whole. "I mean, no disrespect," he stammered. You got a kind way about you. Reminds me of Tala, my withfly, Not in looks, not exactly just in heart. The mention of resemblance struck Joyce unexpectedly. Her smile faltered. Oh, so I remind you of her. That doesn't feel entirely good, Owen. He blinked, confused. No, I didn't miss Joyce. I didn't mean it wrong. But she had already taken a small step back, protective instincts rising. She wasn't angry, just uncertain, wary of being anyone's ghost. It's cold, she said gently. We should go inside. Will you join us for dinner? The children would like that. Before Owen could answer, the little ones swarmed him, tugging his hands, his coat, his sleeves. Stay, eat with us, tell us stories about goats. Owen's tension melted a little at their laughter. He glanced at Joyce, then nodded. I'd be honored. Inside, the warmth welcomed them, like an embrace. The long table glowed under lamplight. The children chattered endlessly, asking Owen about goats, about winters in the foothills, about why milk tasted sweeter when warmed on the stove. He answered shyly at first, then with growing ease. Joyce watched him from across the table, the gentleness in his hands, the way he bent close to hear a child speak, the quiet smile that softened his usually serious face. Something stirred in her chest, something tender, something uninvited. She wasn't afraid of it, just unprepared. Later, after the dishes were washed and the last story was told, Joyce walked Owen to the door. The snow had begun falling again, soft flakes drifting like feathers. Thank you, she said, for everything you've done. He nodded, eyes warm. Seeing you all eat, hearing the little ones laugh, that's thanks enough. Then in a low voice meant only for her, you brought a bit of light back to me, Miss Joyce. She flushed. It's late. You should head home before the snow deepens. She closed the door lightly, not in anger, but to steady her own emotions. Behind it, Owen stood for a moment, staring at the wood grain as though reading something written there. Then he smiled, a soft, private smile, and walked into the night, the falling snow catching in his braids like tiny stars. Winter loosened its grip only a little, but even that small mercy made Bitter Creek feel less like a place carved out of hardship. Each morning afterward, Owen walked the snow-packed trail from his homestead to the orphanage, pushing his old cart with its crates of bread, milk, and whatever vegetables he'd bartered for in town. And each morning, the children burst out the door before he even reached the porch. Dad Owen's here. He never corrected them. The first time a child called him that, he'd nearly dropped the jug he was holding. But hearing it again and again, soft, excited, trusting, warmed something in him that had been frozen for far too long. Joyce welcomed him with a smile each day, though a small part of her still wrestled with the awkward misunderstanding between them. She hadn't meant to be sharp the night she asked if he only liked her, because she reminded him of his late wife. But she'd had trouble shaking the fear of becoming someone else's memory. Even so, when she saw him trudging through the snow with his cart, shoulders broad beneath his worn coat, cheeks red from the cold, it was impossible not to feel a flutter in her chest. A gentle warmth, a budding affection she tried mostly without success to hide. Owen fixed everything he saw broken, not out of pride, not for praise, just because doing so made the world feel manageable again. One morning, he repaired a cracked window pane before Joyce could fetch the tools. Another day, he mended the splintered step on the porch. Sometimes he swept the chimney. Sometimes he chopped enough wood to keep the stove fed for a week. Joyce would scold him lightly. You work too hard for someone who doesn't live here. He always shook his head with that quiet smile. I work just enough for the people who do. Those words sank into her like warmth from a sunbeam, bright, gentle, unexpected. And then came Ellen Brooks. She arrived mid-January, stepping off the stagecoach with a fashionable hat that didn't suit Bitter Creek's winds and a pair of shoes that sank straight into the snow. Joyce had been expecting a new helper for the kitchen, but she hadn't expected Ellen brown curls, striking blue eyes, a handkerchief that smelled faintly of lilac. She smiled politely at Joyce, but with an edge too sharp to hide. "I'm here to assist with the meals," Ellen announced. "I heard Bitter Creek Home needed someone civilized." Joyce blinked. "We needed someone capable. If you can cook, we'll be grateful." Elaine smiled a little too sweetly. "Oh, I can cook." But she couldn't, not really. Her biscuits were so hard the children used them as marbles. Her stews were thin and bitter. She complained that the stove was too small, the pans too old, the children too noisy. She sighed constantly, as if charity work offended her sensibilities. And then she met Owen. He had come in with his cart right as Ellen was burning another pot of beans. When he stepped through the door, snow clinging to his braids, carrying 2 warm jugs of goat's milk, Elaine nearly dropped her ladle. My, she purred. "You must be Mr. Lonehill. Joyce talks about you quite a lot." Joyce flushed scarlet. "I do not." But Ellen had already drifted closer to Owen, tilting her head, lashes fluttering far more dramatically than necessary. "You're taller than I expected," she said. "And stronger too, I imagine." Owen stepped back, confused. "Ma'am, I just brought milk." That made Joyce bite her lip to keep from laughing. But Ellen's eyes narrowed the moment she saw the children swarm around Owen, tugging at his sleeves, shouting, "Bo, Owen, come see the snow fort." Ellen's voice sharpened. "Bo, Owen? They call you father?" Owen shrugged modestly. "Only the small ones." Joyce smiled at how flustered he looked. But Ellen's gaze slid from Owen to Joyce, and what Joyce saw there made her stomach tighten. Jealousy. Pure, unmasked jealousy. Despite Ellen's prickliness, life at the orphanage brightened in 100 small ways. Owen often stayed through midday, helping Joyce teach the older children how to repair farm tools or care for animals. On warmer afternoons, he'd bring the children to his goat pasture. Little Sarah clung to his hand, giggling as she tried to milk an especially stubborn doe. "You gotta be gentle," Owen told her. "She kicks if she thinks you're rushing her." "Just like Miss Joyce," Jonas teased. Joyce gasped. "Jonas!" Owen laughed, a deep, warm sound Joyce wished she could bottle. Once, Owen tripped over a bucket and splashed a full stream of milk straight onto Joyce's skirt. She froze, dripping. Owen froze too, horrified. I'm sorry, Miss Joyce, I didn't." And then the children exploded into laughter. Joyce joined them. And eventually, so did Owen, leaning against the barn door frame, cheeks flushed with embarrassment and amusement. Moments like that, small, unpolished, stitched his heart back together, thread by thin thread. Moments like that made Joyce rethink everything she believed about loneliness. But Elaine saw all of it. Every laugh, every shared glance, every ESTV closeness. The more Joyce and Owen grew comfortable around each other, the more Elaine's simmering resentment deepened. She wasn't cruel, not openly. She was simply sharp in all the wrong places. When Joyce praised Owen, Ellen whispered, "People like him always leave eventually." When the children hugged him, she muttered, "Don't get attached. He's not your real father." When Owen walked into the kitchen, she straightened her hair and leaned closer, saying, "A strong man deserves a proper woman." Joyce pretended not to hear, but she did. Owen pretended not to notice, but he did. And beneath the quiet joy that filled Bitter Creek Home, a small shadow began to stretch thin as a crack in a window pane, but growing with each passing day. For the first time since Christmas Eve, Joyce felt something uneasy stirring inside the home, something that would not stay quiet much longer. The wind shifted the last week of February, blowing hard enough to rattle the shutters of Bitter Creek Home. Snow piled in soft ridges against the porch steps and drifted into the yard in shapes that looked like sleeping beasts. Inside, the children gathered close to the stove, cutting paper snowflakes or playing marbles on the wooden floor. Joyce had just finished checking the pantry, a relief for once, stocked with flour and vegetables, thanks to Owen's steady kindness, when a sudden clatter echoed from the kitchen. A pot hitting the floor. Then a sharp cry. "Joyce!" came Ellen's voice, shrill and trembling. "Miss Harper, get in here!" Joyce hurried toward the sound, Owen following from the hallway with 2 buckets of water balanced on his hips. The moment they stepped into the kitchen, Elaine was standing beside the big iron stove, her apron dusted in white, her face twisted in indignation. The large mixing bowl on the table was filled with a strange, muddy-looking paste. Dark specks clung to the rim, and the smelly, earthy acrid hit Joyce like a strike to the sense. Ellen jabbed a finger toward the bowl. "Look what she did," she shrieked, voice wobbling theatrically. "Joyce ruined the supper. She must have dropped dirt or ashes into the dough." Joyce blinked, stunned. "What?" "Ellen, I haven't been near that bowl. You know I've been in the pantry." "That's your excuse." Ellen whipped around dramatically, waving the wooden spoon like a judge's gavel. "These children depend on us, and you're careless, neglectful. You don't deserve to run this place." The children, drawn by the noise, crowded at the doorway, whispering nervously. Owen quietly set the buckets down, his brow furrowed, dark eyes narrowing. He had seen plenty of lies in his life lease, shaped to look like truth. They always carried a tremor, a twitch, a shine in the eyes that didn't match the words. Aileen had all 3. Joyce steadied herself, fighting the sting behind her eyes. "Ellen, I would never sabotage the children's food. Why would you accuse me of such a thing?" "Because someone ruined it," Ellen snapped, pointing again. "And you're the only one careless enough to do it." "Hey, that ain't true," Jonas shouted from the doorway. "Miss Joyce never messes up anything." A few of the younger children echoed him, bravely puffing up their chests. But Aileen whirled on them, face tight with fury. "Stay out of this. You children don't know what you're talking about." Owen stepped forward, voice low and calm. "Ellen, you ought to watch how you talk to them." The room froze. Aileen swallowed, but quickly regained her false composure, smoothing her apron. "I'm only telling the truth. Someone put dirt in that dough. Look at it. Joyce must have tracked it in from outside or—" "Wait." The small word came from a soft but steady voice. Little Sarah, only 8, stepped forward from the group. Her mittened hand pointed toward the kitchen floor. "Why are there footprints over by the flour sack?" she asked. Joyce's gaze darted to the corner. Sure enough, the packed sack of flour had a few smudges on the outside, and the earth-colored trail leading from it to the bowl did not match her small boot prints, nor the children's worn shoes, but a larger, sharper heel. Jonas crouched to inspect the ground more closely. "This dirt's from the storage shed," he said confidently. "It's redder than the dirt inside. Miss Joyce didn't go out there yet today, I know, 'cause I was the one chopping wood." A murmur rose among the kids. Owen walked to the tracks, crouching with careful precision. His fingers brushed one of the prints. "These are made by narrow heels," he said quietly. Then he lifted his head. "Not by Joyce, not by the children." His gaze drifted toward Aileen. Aileen stiffened. "Are you suggesting—" Jonas interrupted, raising something he'd found on the floor. A small clump of dirt, stuck to the underside of a metal spoon. "I saw her," Jonas blurted out. "I saw Miss Aileen slip into the kitchen before Miss Joyce came back. She had a bowl in her hands then." Aileen's face blanched. "That's a lie," she snapped. But no child flinched. No child backed down. And then little Sarah, voice trembling but brave, added, "You always look angry when Bo Owen talks to Miss Joyce. Maybe you wanted to make her look bad." A flush of furious red climbed Ellen's throat. Her perfect composure cracked just a hair but enough for the room to feel it. Owen rose slowly to his full height. His voice was steady, firm, unshakable. Joyce is the heart of this place. She ain't careless. She ain't cruel. And she sure as sunrise don't deserve being accused for someone else's swipe. Joyce's breath caught. No one had ever defended her like that before, calmly, powerfully, as though her worth was beyond question. Ellen looked from face to face, searching for any support, any sympathy. She found none. Her voice faltered, brittle as cracked ice. He was only trying to... To what? Owen asked softly. Her gaze darted away. To help, she whispered, but even she didn't believe the word anymore. The silence that followed was heavy and fine and final. With stiff shoulders and wounded pride, Elaine grabbed her coat from the hook, spun on her heel, and marched toward the door. She flung it open, letting a blast of cold air whip through the room. I don't need this place, she spat over her shoulder, or any of you. And then she was gone, boots crunching through the snow, until even that sound faded into the winter wind. Joyce sagged against the counter, breath shaking. The children swarmed her, hugging her legs, tugging her sleeves. We knew you didn't do it, Mama. You're the best. We'd never let them take you away. She laughed softly through tears, kissing their cheeks one by one. But when her gaze rose to Owen, standing solid and steady as the spine of the Rockies, something deeper stirred in her. Thank you, she whispered. Owen stepped closer, his eyes warm with something unspoken. Didn't do nothing but tell the truth. The children didn't miss the way they looked at each other. And somewhere inside that small, drafty orphanage, something shifted, quiet, but certain. The fate itself were leaning gently toward them. Winter softened its grip on Bitter Creek as the year moved on, trading blizzards for gentler snows and long nights for longer daylight. Spring seeped slowly into the land, filling the creek with meltwater and coaxing the cottonwoods into their first shy buds. By summer, the valley hummed with cicadas, and by autumn, strong harvest winds swept leaves across the fields in swirling gold. Through it all, Owen became a fixture at Bitter Creek home. He didn't just visit. He belonged there. Every morning he arrived with fresh milk and bread. Every evening, he fixed something, mended a loose hinge, patched a quilt, or built a new bench, sturdy enough to hold 4 giggling children at once. He took the children riding, taught them how to read animal tracks, and showed them how to braid rope from rawhide strips. More than once, Joyce caught him carrying a little one asleep on his shoulder, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. And as for her, Owen spoke to her differently now, softly, warmly, honestly. The awkwardness of their early misunderstanding faded like fog in sunlight. She learned his rhythms, the gentle quiet of him, the way his laughter started low and surprise, as if joy still felt new to him. And Owen, in turn, found comfort in her steady presence, in the way she listened, in the gentle firmness of her voice when wrangling 17 children felt like taming a stampede. By late autumn, Owen had moved into a small bunkhouse near the orphanage, close enough to help, far enough to keep propriety. The children pretended not to understand why he chose to live there instead of his own homestead, but their knowing smiles told the truth. Bo Owen likes Mama Joyce, they whispered smugly. And for the first time, neither Owen nor Joyce corrected them. When the first snow of December fell, a quiet, delicate curtain of white, the children demanded they begin decorating for Christmas at once. Owen chopped down a pine taller than he was and hauled it through the door on his shoulder, scattering needles everywhere as the children trailed behind him like ducklings. They strung garlands of dried berries and popcorn. They twisted ribbons. They placed tin stars atop branches, their laughter ringing through the rafters like sleigh bells. Joyce stood back at one point, hands clasped, awed by how full and bright the room felt. A year ago, they'd had barely enough food for supper and grief hanging in every corner. Now laughter filled the walls, hope warmed the floors. And Owen quiet, gentle Owen was at the center of it. That alone was its own miracle. On Christmas Eve, as twilight slid across the valley, in long blue shadows, the children begged to build snowmen in the yard before supper. So out they went, bundled in scarves and mittens, rolling huge balls of snow across the open field. Owen helped them craft a towering snowman with a crooked smile and a hat borrowed from the barn. Joyce shaped a smaller one beside it, delicate and graceful. "Those two look like a married couple," Jonas teased loudly. Joyce's cheeks turned pink. Owen coughed into his glove. The children roared with laughter. As they tromped back to the porch, stamping snow from their boots, Jonas nudged the others. They whispered, giggled, then suddenly pushed Joyce and Owen gently toward each other beneath the doorway. "Mistletoe," they cried, even though it was mostly just a sprig tied with red ribbon. Joyce raised her brows. "Where did you even get mistletoe out here?" "Doesn't matter," the kids chorused. "Kiss, kiss." Owen's face flushed a deep, warm red. He looked ready to run straight into the snowbanks, but Joyce steadied him with a touch to his sleeve. "It's just a kiss," she said quietly. "If you want to." His dark eyes softened, all the old grief mingling with something tender and new. "I've wanted to for a long while," he admitted. The world seemed to hush around them. Snow drifted softly from the eaves. Lantern light pooled warm at their feet. And with a breath that trembled just a little, Owen leaned in and kissed her. It was not hurried, not uncertain, just gentle, full of gratitude and hope, and a love that had taken the long way around to reach them. The children burst into applause, cheering loud enough to be heard clear to the creek. Joyce laughed into Owen's shoulder. Owen wrapped an arm around her, steady and sure. "I never thought I'd find a home again," he murmured. Joyce pressed her forehead to his. "You didn't find one, Owen. You helped us build it." He kissed her once more, snow melting on his lashes. Inside, supper waited: warm stew, fresh bread, and a tree shining bright with handmade ornaments. But for a moment, neither of them moved. They simply stood together beneath the falling snow, surrounded by children who finally knew what it meant to belong. And in that quiet, holy stillness, Owen Lonehill realized something with absolute certainty. He was no longer a man visiting the edges of life. He was part of a family, part of a future, part of a love that made the long winters of Bitter Creek feel gentle at last. A new year would come. More storms, more seasons, more laughter. And he would face all of it, with Joyce by his side, and 17 small hearts calling him Dad Owen. It was, without question, the brightest Christmas he had ever known. And so Bitter Creek found its light again, born not from grandeur, but from quiet courage, shared burdens, and the healing power of family rediscovered. May the warmth of their story remind us that even in the coldest winters, a single act of kindness can change the shape of a life. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe, like, share, and leave a comment so I can continue creating more heartfelt videos. Thank you all for listening.